Barbara's going to make an announcement, and then I have some things to remind you of and to tell you about, and then I will introduce our speaker for today. So, Barbara,
and the opinions that I express will be my own and not those of the State Department. Now, today, as we discuss the Armenian genocide, it's obviously a vast topic and one that can't be fully dealt with in this short period of time. So what I would like to do is break it into two parts, because I know that the theme is remembrance and resistance. So for the first part of the lecture, what I would like to do is kind of give you an overview of the Armenian genocide, the context and peoples. They look to see how the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Montenegrins, the Albanians, etc., had armed themselves and had won their independence. In fact, at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where some of these issues were discussed, the Russians had defeated the Turks in a war and had gotten a very good and favorable settlement, but the European powers, especially Great Britain, were very suspicious of Russian motives. And for Armenians to work in their villages was really precarious, so many of them came to the United States and worked in factories, worked in mills. And they first came to the East Coast, to New England, and then gradually they came out to places like Fresno, for example. What they wanted to do was save money. They didn't want to stay here. They wanted to save money. They wanted to go back home eventually and buy a plot of land and settle down. But that didn't happen, because by 1914, World War I breaks out. But right before the World War had broken out, there was finally a reform plan. The great powers, who had always used the Armenians and others for their own purposes, and this must be viewed in the context of an overwhelming British-Russian rivalry, because the British, which had this far-flung world empire, were obsessed that the British undertook was for the safety of India. And the Ottoman Empire, which ruled Armenia and the Arab provinces, was viewed as the gateway, or one of the gateways, to India. And of course, we have something called the Great Game, where Britain and Russia were competing in places like Central Asia and Afghanistan. And the British were really to the point of paranoia about what the Russians were up to. And because Armenia, the geographical area of Armenia, saddled the Ottoman-Russian border, the British viewed any attempts to help the Armenians as a gain for Russia. And so that had to be stopped at all costs. And the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire had to be preserved. So there's a great power component to this. And finally, in 1914, in February, before together, and they had decided that the Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire needed reform. Because if the reforms didn't come, then the Russians were going to take advantage of the situation, and the French and the British, etc., didn't want that. So they had two governors, Westerners, Europeans, were going to be appointed into two large provinces, Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire, and they were going to reorganize the Young Turks for this Committee of Union and Progress, which was headed by a triumvirate of three Turks, so Cemal Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Talat Pasha, and they would be the equivalent for the Armenians of, say, Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, etc. They went in on the German side during the war with the hope that they would be able to reach their goals of a pan-Turkic empire, which means unifying, because they had lost the one people that is really in the way are the Armenians. So it was decided that the best way to solve this Armenian question was to embark on a premeditated plan to remove the Armenians from Armenia and to exterminate them. So beginning in the spring of 1915, a deportation order was sent to all of the provinces by the government, saying that the Armenians needed to be relocated because they were in war zones. Simultaneous to this written order that went out for deportation, messengers went out to all of the provinces from the Committee of Union and Progress carrying verbal orders. And those verbal orders said, ignore the written orders, deportation means extermination. In terms of how this actually played out, when the war broke out, because there were manpower, everyone was drafted into the Ottoman army. And after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Christians were also allowed to serve in the army. So all the Armenian men were drafted, put into the army, put into labor battalions, and then either worked to death or exterminated outright. So what does this leave? This leaves the women, the children, the elderly in their villages defenseless. So normally a deportation order would be Armenians anywhere from 1 day to 3 days to sell all of their belongings, to pack up, and to be put on the deportation trail. Now, simultaneous to this, in the major cities of the Ottoman Empire, most notably Istanbul, Constantinople, the Armenian intelligentsia was rounded up, and this was on April 24th, 1915, and that's why April 24th is considered the Armenian Memorial Day, because it was on that night that all of the leaders of the Armenian community were rounded up and executed, thus decapitating the Armenian community of its leadership. So it's the teachers, the lawyers, the doctors, the clergy, the intellectuals, the newspaper editors, the artists, the writers, they were all done away with. The men serving in the army were exterminated. So now you have the women, and the women, the children, the elderly, they go on the death march, and it is a death. Because where are they supposed to be deported to? Technically, they're being deported to a safer zone, but that safer zone happens to be the deserts of northern Syria, where no provisions whatsoever are undertaken for their safe arrival. So on the march, the Kurds are allowed to attack and plunder and rape and loot. The Turkish gendarmes also participate. Convoys of thousands and tens of thousands, sometimes a few dozen only, would reach their destination in the deserts of northern Syria, where they then would die of disease. This also needs to be put in the context of a religious war. The Ottoman Empire had declared a jihad against the Allied powers at the outset of World War I, ignoring the fact that they of Christian Germany and Christian Austro-Hungary. Nonetheless, they declared a jihad, and they told the people that whoever kills a Christian in the name of Allah will not suffer any retribution. So the people were whipped up, and they were doing what they considered their religious duty. But not all of them, and that's another very important part of this story. Just like you have the righteous Gentile in the Holocaust, you have the righteous Turk and the righteous Kurd. Because an order was given by the Ottoman government that whoever protects an Armenian shall lose their life. But despite this, thousands of Armenians were saved through the kindness of Turks and Kurds. And we all have family members that were saved this way. And so that's something that we must always remember. And the research is only just beginning on some of these righteous Kurds. So the death marches take place over 1915, 1916. And out of a pre-war, and when we talk about statistics, they're very sketchy because we don't have absolute statistics. But out of a population of around 2 million, a little more, roughly 1.5 million Armenians are exterminated. So a very large percentage of the Armenians, and these are the ones in Ottoman Armenia or Western Armenia. Now, at the time that this is going on, you have a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is on the losing end of this war, and the Russian troops come into many parts of Armenia and find it desolate. And so through 1915, 1916, the Russians are in occupation of many of these areas. But then in 1917, there's the Russian Revolution, and these troops want to just go home. They've had it. They're tired, and the Bolsheviks are promising them peace, land, and bread. So the Russian troops start to leave the front. Now, what does that mean? That means that the Armenians that were in the Russian Empire are now left to try to defend the border along with the few survivors. And so from 1917 on, it's a very precarious position, and the Ottomans are through the lines that have been broken because the Russians have gone back home, and they're moving into eastern Armenia, which was the part of Armenia under the Russians. And there they threatened to complete the genocide by exterminating the eastern Armenians, just as they had exterminated the western Armenians. But here is a story of resistance, because in May of 1918, the Armenians, it was a pan-Armenian movement. The Armenian troops that had been in the Russian army gathered in the Caucasus and fought on the front, and they were supported by villagers, women carrying water, children carrying ammunition, because they knew if they didn't resist, they would be exterminated. So in May of 1918, they fought the Turks, and they beat them. And then they declared an independent republic. And this independent republic lasted for a very short period of time, only from 1918 to 1920. The RC no longer exists as an independent entity, but exists as a Soviet Socialist republic. And that situation will stay stable until the late 1980s. And now I want to wrap up this part and draw some overall conclusions and some connections, and then show how the idea and the perception of the genocide played out later on. Because we're talking about instances of resistance, there were a few instances of resistance in the Armenian genocide. Not all of them went to their deaths willingly. In particular, there were 4 instances that for the Armenians would be the equivalent of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And these include the eastern cities of Van, and also Urfa, Shabin, Karahisar, and most importantly, a battle that took place on the mountain of Moses, known as Musadah. At Musadah, the Armenians gathered and they decided to be deported. And they went up, they took the women, the children, all of their possessions, and they went up to the mountain and they resisted. They resisted for about 40 days, and this is on the Mediterranean coast. And finally, a French warship they signaled a French warship. The French warship came and rescued them and took them to Egypt, where the men then enlisted in the French and British armies to fight against. And Verf, the real humanitarian, wrote a novel called The 40 Days of Musadah, which was subsequently banned and burnt by the Nazis. In the 40 Days of Musadah, and he chose specifically the 40 days because of the Christian iconography of the 40 days of the suffering of Christ in the desert before his crucifixion. And this book served as inspiration for the Jewish resistance fighters in the ghettos throughout Europe. A very admirable and respected Israeli scholar, Yair Oron, has written about this extensively. And he talked to Holocaust survivors, and he was told stories how this book was passed and read in the ghettos. And the decision was made that we are going to die. There is no doubt that we are going to die. But we have a choice as to we can either go to our deaths as sheep, or we can use the Armenian example and we can go to our deaths fighting. Because it's the same. Death is the same. It's how we choose to accept that death. And so it was an inspiration for many of the Jewish resistance fighters during the Holocaust. There are also some other interesting connections between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. And I would like to point out, for those of you that have had an opportunity to go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, you will see a quote by Hitler referencing the Armenian genocide. In August of 1939, literally days before he unleashed his war of aggression against Poland, some of his commanders questioned what he had in mind for the civilian population, not just Jews, but Slavs and what he called other Untermenschen, other subhumans. Hitler said, don't worry about it. Nobody remembers what happened to the Armenians. And how did Hitler know about the Armenian genocide? Well, there was a prominent German official in the Ottoman Empire at the time, and his name was Erwin von Schuebner-Richter. And von Schuebner-Richter was one of the earliest Nazis and was killed during the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. In fact, his arm was linked with Hitler's arm, and when he was shot and killed and fell to the ground, it dislocated Hitler's shoulder. This man wrote voluminous reports back from the Empire to the German Foreign Ministry about the extermination of the Armenians, and these documents are all available. So surely he talked to Adolf Hitler about this. Adolf Hitler was also in Berlin in 1921 when an Armenian assassin killed Talat Pasha, one of the architects of the Armenian genocide, hunted him down, killed him in broad daylight, was tried by a German court, and was acquitted. And certainly all of this was, Hitler saw this as well. Another interesting connection is from Raphael Lemkin, who was the Polish-Jewish international lawyer who actually coined the word genocide in 1944 to describe the ongoing destruction of European Jewry, but he had another case in mind as well. And if you look at his papers, there are numerous references to the destruction of the Armenians. Now, why does this matter in elections? Well, it's through our comparative work that we can try to understand, for example, the Holocaust and all of its complexity, or the Rwandan genocide, or what's going on in Darfur, or what have you. Now, if we wrap up this part and we now look to how was the genocide remembered in Armenia among this remnant of the Armenian nation in 1984. So the Soviets built this grand narrative, and in Armenia it played out as follows. The Armenians are incapable, essentially, and this is a simplification, but these are the general lines. The Armenians are incapable of standing on their own 2 feet. They suffered from the genocide, and it's only an outside power that can come and rescue them. And we are that outside power, the Russians. Whether Bolshevik, whether imperial, it doesn't matter. And this was the taken for many years. And Soviet Armenians' ability to remember the genocide was hostage to the vicissitudes of Soviet-Turkish relations. When Soviet-Turkish relations were good, the Armenians were not really allowed to speak about the genocide too openly. When Soviet-Turkish relations were bad, they were given more leeway. Then something strange happened. 1965, April 24th, the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, compromise actually allowed the construction of a genocide memorial on a hill, Swallows Hill, Dzirnagabert, in Yerevan. And every year since then, on April 24th, hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million Armenians will walk to that memorial, which is an eternal flame surrounded by 12 inward-looking pillars for each one of the lost Armenian provinces. And then next to that, there is an obelisk. And the obelisk is in 2 parts to signify the homeland and the Armenian diaspora and their unity. So every year under Soviet rule from the 1960s on through the 70s and 80s, the Armenians were allowed to discuss the genocide, but as long as you drew the right conclusions that the Russians came in and saved you. Then when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he began these processes that we all know in history. It was that when you open that safety valve and you allow people to talk, sometimes they won't shut up. And they just talked and talked and talked. And some of this talk turned to subjects that the Soviets found to be unacceptable. For example, first they talked about the environment in say, Armenia. Well, how can anyone talking about the environment be viewed as seditious or undermining Soviet rule? Well, what was the reason, for example, the degradation of well, it would be Soviet industrialization policies. Well, who was responsible for Soviet industrialization policies but Joseph Stalin? And what else was Stalin responsible for but all sorts of other crimes and atrocities? So once the cork was taken out of the bottle, things began to spiral. And in the Armenian case, the real breaking point was in 1988, beginning in February, when the Armenians of a region known as Nagorno-Karabakh, which had been assigned, it was a 90 Armenian majority region, was assigned to Soviet Azerbaijan by Joseph Stalin. And Stalin did this, and he, for one reason, was to get to use the divide and rule tactic. Another reason was to placate the Turks, the Kemalists, who were allies with the Azerbaijanis and wanted this situation so that they could have some sort of leverage as well. So Shivan, that had about a 50% Armenian majority, and Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an overwhelming Armenian majority. And the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh in February 1988 decided that they were going to take Glasnost seriously, and their local legislature petitioned the Soviet Central Authorities to secede from Soviet Azerbaijan and join Soviet Armenia. Of about 180,000 or so Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, over 100,000 people, in fact, there were demonstrations in their capital, there were demonstrations of sympathy in the Armenian capital, and then within a couple weeks in late February, early March 1988, there was a pogrom, a massacre of Armenians in the Soviet Azerbaijani industrial city of Sumgait. And for Armenians, Sumgait was a turning point. The Azerbaijanis had lists of where the Armenians lived in the city. They had it by apartment. The mobs were given sharpened stakes, sharpened metal rods, hammers, etc., to attack the Armenians. They burnt them. They threw them out into the courtyard. They raped the women, and then they would throw gasoline on them, etc. Now, for the Armenians, what image is going to come to their mind immediately? It's going to be 1915. And so the demonstrations that took place after this in Armenia, people were dumbfounded. Placards, very simple. 1915 equals 1988. Sumgait equals genocide. So for the Armenians, this essentially broke a tacit social contract between the Soviet central government that preserved the physical and viability of the Armenian people. And in return, the Armenian people gave their begrudging, but nonetheless their loyalty to the Soviet state, because it's not much in the Russians and the Turks for an Armenian. But once Sumgait took place, they started to rethink this rationale that if Armenians are no longer safe, then maybe we need to rethink our whole raison d'etre for being in the Soviet Union. So what happens after that? A downward spiral of violence. The Armenians and the Azerbaijanis both form self-defense units to defend the border and fight. In the Armenian perspective, many of the volunteer fighters from Armenia that went to fight in Nagorno-Karabakh were motivated by their historical memories that had been passed down from generation to generation about the Armenian genocide. I interviewed many of them and I asked them what their motivations were, and they said, well, one example, there's a village north of the capital of Yerevan that was never threatened by any war, any fighting, but now is one of self-reliance. That if we depend upon an outside source, we are doomed. But if we rely upon ourselves, we have a fighting chance to survive. So the genocide was a subtext throughout the Armenian democratic movement that took place from 1988 to 1991, as Armenia was striving to redefine itself, whether it should stay in the Soviet Union, whether it should not stay in the Soviet Union. And historians and other academics and intellectuals in Armenia played a very important role in this psychological repositioning, this reevaluation. For example, under Glasnost, the press became more or less free. So what you had is no longer state-controlled newspapers and journals, but people allowed to print their own newspapers and journals. And in almost every single newspaper and journal in Armenia from this 1988 to 1991 period, you had columns in the newspapers devoted to historical themes. We're not talking about newspapers like, that would be the equivalent of, say, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You're talking about a newspaper that could come from, the agricultural workers of a particular collective farm, and, with one article on the nuts and bolts of repairing a tractor, next to that, an article about the genocide or about the Armenian liberation movement. So there was really this flourishing of interest in history, and one of my colleagues in Armenia, who's a noted ethnographer, came up with a very interesting phrase, and he said, in those days, history became hero. And so it was through these historical narratives and this differing perspective on Armenian history that led to a delegitimized, at the time, over 60 million versus an Armenian population of 3.5 million. But nonetheless, there was this drive to rethink and to redefine. And the genocide, the lessons that were drawn from the genocide, led the people to believe that maybe, if they play their cards a little differently this time, they will be able to survive and to flourish. In 1990, this is a year and a half before the Soviet Union collapses, the Armenians elect a democratic government. So it's kind of an anomalous situation, a democratic Armenian Soviet Republic within a non-democratic Soviet Union. And and these conversations continued and continued. And when Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to have a referendum about the state of the Union in 1991 in the spring, we are going to look at the Soviet Constitution, take advantage of a clause that says we don't have to participate in this referendum. We will have a referendum 6 months later to determine our status. So in March, they didn't take part in the referendum, but they did take part in a referendum that took place in September of 1991. But in August of 1991, there was an abortive coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, which led to the collapse and the destruction of the Soviet Union. And thus Armenia, also difficult to rebel when most of your men have been drafted into the army. But there's been this ongoing campaign of denial that has taken place ever since the foundation of the Turkish Republic. And how does that play out on the level of geopolitics? Well, the Turkish border with Armenia is blockaded. Turkey refuses to have diplomatic relations with Armenia. They've recognized their independence, but they don't have relations. Technically, it's because the Armenians occupy Nagorno-Karabakh. But the real reason is Turkey's unease and discomfort with the issue of the genocide. It is largely a taboo topic in Turkey. People that do discuss it are sometimes jailed. For example, there's one human rights activist, Ragip Zarakolu, who has a printing house. His printing house has been burned down 3 times because he has printed material on the Armenian side. People have been arrested for having maps with the geographical designation Armenia on them. People that are, say, Westerners, Armenian diaspora, descendants of genocide survivors that go back to Turkey to try to find their ancestral villages, are shadowed by the Turkish security services and harassed. Any Turkish intellectual or academic that tries to write on the genocide is largely forced, except for uses the term Armenian genocide, calls it by its rightful name. In Turkish, you don't talk about the Armenian genocide in the Turkish language, you talk about the alleged Armenian genocide. Sözde Ermeni soykırımı, the alleged Armenian genocide. It's always in quotation marks. It's viewed as a tragedy. It's viewed as a civil war, etc. So for Armenia, this is a national security question, because you have this unrepentant genocidal regime on your border that says, we never did anything, but if you don't behave yourselves, we'll do it again. And in fact, members of the Turkish General Staff have said the Armenians have to realize that they need to learn the lessons of 1915. Well, how does that going to play out in a small country that's landlocked and surrounded? Despite this, the Armenian government has said we will establish relations with Turkey with no preconditions, which means you don't have a priori, but maybe we can discuss it afterwards. And there have been some movements towards a dialogue, but it's really in its infant stages. And until Turkey can democratize adequately, there probably will be no real movement on this issue. So in conclusion, what I would like to just say is to try to demonstrate, through some comparative work, how the Armenian genocide played out and still plays out in Armenia today, have very important ramifications. I think for those of us in the United States, it's very difficult because we come from such a young country, right? We're only a little over 200 years old. For people like the Jews or the Armenians that have a civilization dating back millennia, there's a lot of remembering that goes on. So with that, I will thank you, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
If you don't mind, I'll
Yeah, that would be fine.
okay, get your questions ready, write them down. Elaine?
I have two questions. One, well, first let me say, I really appreciated the fact that you made the connections with the Holocaust. That was really very helpful to me. Two, I wonder if you could, this is only speculation, but is there anything written or do people argue that Hitler got the idea for the Holocaust from the Armenian genocide, after all?
Well, of course, this is speculation because we don't have, just like we don't have a smoking gun document with Hitler's signature that says, kill all the Jews. And some Holocaust deniers will use that very fact to say, well, Hitler didn't know. So we can only speculate, but I think that the preponderance of evidence, this quote to his generals, the relationship that he had with Schubner-Richter, the fact that he was present in Berlin at the time of a very high-profile trial, I think could lead one to believe that he certainly was aware, and very well aware, of the Armenian genocide.
Let me follow up. Could you say something about the United States' political stance on the Armenian genocide?
A very complicated question
I know your position.
Well, first of all, this is in my capacity as a statement. The last time a president used the word genocide was Ronald Reagan. Every year since the mid-'80s, you had euphemisms about the terrible events of 1915, the tragedy. Although in 2001, I believe, the current President Bush actually gave the textbook definition of genocide without using the word. Talked about the extermination or something. So there are geopolitical factors involved in this as well. And the U.S. ambassador to Armenia has just gotten in a little bit of trouble recently because he was on a tour of the United States, and while he was here in California, in Berkeley specifically, he called the Armenian genocide what it was, and said that he had actually studied the documents and had read extensively. And then he had to clarify his position by saying he did that in his personal capacity and that it was inappropriate between the Kurds and Israel and the Armenians. And well, from the Armenian perspective, the situation with the Kurds is always a little bit touchy because during the killing instrument, one of the killing instruments during the genocide were the Kurds. In fact, there's an interesting story told by a Kurd that after a particular massacre of the Armenians, the Kurds, during the genocide, the Kurds were celebrating. But their commander was not celebrating. And his men went up to him and said, well, why aren't you celebrating? And he said, well, there's nothing to celebrate because now there's nothing between the Turk and the Kurd. So the Kurds have borne the brunt of Turkish oppression since the Armenian genocide. They have been subject to ethnic cleansing. Up until very recently, they were not even called Kurds. They were designated as Mountain Turks who had lost their language. Okay?
history, so I might need some correction with this question. It's my recollection that during the time of the Armenian Genocide, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey was Morgenthau, who subsequently became the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury.
His son.
His son. And I gather he was very sympathetic to the situation that was going on over there at the time. But what was the reaction of the U.S. State Department to his reporting?
The question is about who was a Jew. And traditionally, the United States assigned, for a complex set of reasons that I'm still not clear on, they assigned a Jew to be U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And Henry Morgenthau was a very strong supporter of Woodrow Wilson. It raised a lot of money for him. And the reward for that, he was offered the post of U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he initially refused. He said, I don't want to go to this country because I'm a Jew. But his friends, many very prominent members of the Jewish community in the United States, spoke with him, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, etc., and convinced him that he should go. And one of the reasons he should go is because there was the fledgling Zionist movement that was, supporting immigration of Jews into Palestine, which was under Ottoman rule. So in any event, Morgenthau took up his position in the Ottoman Empire. And the genocide, when reports started trickling back from the provinces, because the U.S. had consular agents throughout the empire, and they would send reports back to Morgenthau, he was outraged. And he went to Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha and Cemal, the triumvirs, and he said, this is outrageous. You have to stop this in the name of humanity. And they said to him, what are you complaining about? You're a Jew. We treat the Jews just fine. He said, sir, I am not here as a Jew. I am here as the American ambassador and as a human being. So all of those reports he sent back to the State Department, and Secretary of State Lansing supported his efforts to pressure the Turkish government, the Ottoman government, to stop the massacres. But the massacres couldn't be stopped at that point, so the U.S. turned towards humanitarian relief. And the United States, it was really the first international human rights campaign. And this is a new book by Peter Balakian called The Burning Tigress, which I can recommend to all of you. It's called The Armenian Genocide and the American Response. And he puts the Armenian Genocide in the context of American humanitarianism and how they raised record amounts of money for Armenian and Syrian relief. And that's just a little minor aside, is that we talk about the Armenian Genocide, and that's the commonly accepted term. But it was more than just helped pay them so that they could ransom these children. Some of them had been taken as slaves. In fact, there are numerous pictures of Armenian women, and there's a very important gender component to the Armenian Genocide because the men had been largely exterminated. So it was the women that survived, and from from like an oral history tradition, the women passed on the stories. But there are numerous photographs of Armenian women with tattoos from forehead to chest, because they remember how the U.S. really came to their aid and rescued, so many Armenians. I mean, people like in the 1890s during the period of massacres, people like Clara Barton, the Red Cross, the first overseas Red Cross mission was to the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s to help the Armenians.
Yes.
I have a question. You said that the numbers weren't clear as far as exactly how many people died, but I know you mentioned that in the period between 1890
Massacred because they weren't. You don't deal with that in the Ottoman Empire. Record keeping was not nearly as advanced, but from various sources we've been able to piece together, this figure of about 1.5 million.
The Armenians were indigenous people to Turkey. Would it be correct to say that going back to ancient history that Turks were they nomads?
Descendants today, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the people from Central Asia, as well as Azerbaijanis and the Turks in the Republic of Turkey. So when these huge population movements were taking place in the Middle Ages, that's exactly what happened. They came in and they settled and they settled on this land that today is known as Turkey, but large parts of which were known as historic Armenia. And it's interesting, I just read a piece, this is a paper the other day, that the Turkish government has decided that 3 species of animals whose Latin names include the word Armenia have to be changed. So for example, there's a wild sheep that's known as Ovis armeniana, and it is now Ovis oriente anatolicus. So their denial of everything Armenian has reached the point of actually banning, because they said these are seditious and separatist names. They were former regime elements, as they're called in today's parlance. They were the Young Turks, and many of them have blood on their hands.
They're dead now.
They're dead, yes, but from the very beginning in the 1920s, the founders of this supposed republic were not the heroes that the Turkish state made them out to be. So you had to play with the historical record. And there's also a psychological issue, because for many centuries the Turks felt that they were besieged by foreign powers, and those are, they'll never state it, but that is very much a subtext to all of this.
The reparations.
Reparations.
Having to pay back.
Well, yes, because essentially, what are we saying? We're saying that the crime of genocide pays. That you can commit genocide, you can destroy a 2,500-year-old civilization, and then you can say, I'm sorry. And that's it. That's it. There's no more responsibility. They have been recognition, a precondition for Turkish entry into the European Union. So the issue was raised, but it was not one of the actual criteria for Turkish entry. But it's pretty much, I think, the conventional wisdom that as this very long, drawn-out, decade-plus possibly process takes place, that the Armenian genocide issue will come up, and there will have to be some sort of resolution to it. So how that plays out, where it's too soon.
You know, as you were speaking, I was also thinking of parallels with the Holocaust, about the whole notion that more room was needed for the German people. So we're going to push these people out, move them east so we have more room for our own Aryan race, if you will. Was any of that part of what happened with taking over the lands in Armenian areas, even beginning in the 10th century, if we need more room?
There's always a territorial, and it became more exacerbated when Turkish nationalism began to kind of rear its head and to develop. Because if you look at the Ottoman Empire, you have the Arab provinces, many of which had been gradually detached. You had the Balkan provinces. But in Anatolia or Turkey, you had the Turks, but you also had these other ethnic groups. And they were considered an obstacle in terms of the prominent or the dominant was exclusively Turkey for the Turks. And the parallel with expelling, Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and other undesirables, also has a parallel.
Yes. And then
I was wondering if you would comment on the role of women throughout the whole, say, the last 100 or so years. What is the present status of women
And the question was,
in Armenia?
and this is not of gender equality, meant that women could dig ditches, and then they could go home and take care of their families at the same time.
That sounds familiar.
But in the last, say for example, since independence, the Armenian family has undergone significant trauma because of the blockade from Turkey and the general decline of the economy. The men have migrated to Russia and to other countries for work, leaving the women behind to take care of their families. And so there's a certain level of dysfunction now within the Armenian family because the men are absent, and the men were absent as well, during the genocide and during the 1920s, as a result.
But on the governing parliamentary or whatever.
Oh yeah, there are women in parliament, and there are women that are active in politics. They seem to predominate in the spheres of education and healthcare, and was somewhat of a leftover from Soviet days where certain fields were dominated by men and certain fields were dominated by women.
Are there any Armenian women historians?
There are. In fact, one of my closest friends and colleagues is the head of the State Historical Archive in Armenia. And her example is actually inspiring. She was an Armenian from Azerbaijan that was expelled. And she was expelled here. Really, I think from a gender perspective, the women of Armenia are definitely among the strongest.
We have a student with a question.
Yes.
If the U.S. was to buddy up with Armenia and kind of forego Turkey, would it be a strategic advantage for them? I'm a little sketchy on my geography, so I don't know the actual location of Armenia, but I'm assuming it's pretty close to Turkey.
Yeah, it's on the eastern end of Turkey. It's between Russia in the north, Iran, and Turkey. It's between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. I mean, Armenia is a tiny 3 million people, landlocked, no real natural resources. So I don't think anyone expects the U.S. to forego its important alliance with Turkey for the sake of, this little speck of land. But what we could expect is a more is a foreign policy more consonant with the rhetoric that we hear about human rights and certain democratic values.
Yes.
Can you comment on the Israel government's position on Armenian genocide, and if they're helping basically get rid of this denial, or I think they're allies with Turkey, so how does that play? With that government going through the Holocaust and so on, what's their position? And second, Armenia being a small
an occasional article, but most specifically the work of Yair Oron, A-U-R-O-N, who wrote 2 seminal books one called The Banality of Indifference, the other The Banality of Denial, taking off of Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. And he looks at, in one book he looks at Zionism and the Armenian genocide, and where he traces how the Yeshuv, the Jews in Palestine in this period of the Armenian genocide were cognizant of the genocide. They wrote fearful that this could then happen to them. And in the second, and so he documents all that. He looked at Israeli archives. He looked at Israeli, at Hebrew language, sources, and pieced together this really fascinating story where he talks about, as I mentioned before, the 40 days of Musadah and its impact. In the second book called The Banality of Denial, he specifically talks about the state of Israel and its position. That after the Holocaust, there was essentially 2 trains of thought. One, never again, and the other, never again to us. And he would argue that that many leading members of the government and society are the never again to us. But there are still many people within Israeli society and within Israeli academia that are very supportive of talking about and are embarrassed when the Israeli state decides to support the Turkish view, for geostrategic reasons. For example, a few years ago, the Israeli Minister of Education, Yossi Sarid, participated in an Armenian genocide memorial service in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. And he said, I am here as a Jew, I am here as a human being, and I am here as the Israeli Minister of Education. And the firestorm that broke his head was tremendous. But yet, people like Yehuda Bauer and Israel Charny from Yad Vashem, these people are vociferous in pushing recognition of the Armenian genocide. And they claim that the Israeli state is out of sync and out of tune with the feelings of most Jews and most Israelis. But again, there's this very important geopolitical element where, for geopolitical reasons, Turkey pressures Israel to talk about the Armenian genocide on a state level.
Perhaps you might want to talk about the last part of your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, and the defense.
Well, it's time for us to end. And so if you have questions you'd like to ask of Robert, you can do that. I'd like you to join me in thanking him.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.